Welcome to the Hill of Roses, an independent policy movement and podcast for progress. Rosebuds, we have a pretty special episode today. We're going to be having a little fun and rewarding you, the subscribers, by having an AMA that we had hosted on Twitter. We're going to be answering some of your questions today, whether it be politics or not. So we had in our AMA 18 people send us questions and showing that they are subscribers. And so I wanted to be able to answer some of their questions. The first question that I got was from EpluribusUnumYT. His question was, why should Yang Gang continue to follow Yang when he wants to back on many of his promises, the super PAC, as well as endorsing someone who didn't endorse UBI? Should they not move on to someone better like David Kim? Thank you for the question, EpluribusUnum. So my thoughts on this is that no, we shouldn't be moving on from Yang. I think that there are some times where we do have to be a little bit more critical of him than we are currently. And I do think that it is questionable, some of the decisions, but I think it's respectable that we don't always have to agree with our candidate. And I think the explanations that he's given, as well as in some cases in the terms of the question you gave on the endorsement in terms of UBI, he kind of gave a two-pronged condition. Either someone had to come out and support UBI, or they had to basically become the presumptive nominee. So this was an opportunity that he extended for nearly 2 months. And from that, 1 month. And from that, he basically was waiting for either Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden to be able to reach out and just seize that mantle, or potentially, because at the time when he gave these conditions, it could have been someone like Elizabeth Warren as well, as I know he's been friendly to him. But none of them really came out for it. And some people will say, well, Tulsi Gabbard came out in support of it. And as much as I want to commend Tulsi for the work she's done in trying to have this emergency UBI come forward, first, it was a basic income as well. She was someone who is not really going to get the UBI across the finish line. She was at 1%, and I love Tulsi, but she couldn't actually win. And so we have to actually have someone mean something when they actually endorse it. It doesn't mean anything if they're not going to become the nominee. And so I think it's important when you're trying to build a movement to get the policy accomplished, you're really trying to reach the people who have the influence to actually then accomplish it. And if Tulsi doesn't have the ability to actually accomplish it, then throwing his weight behind her would not necessarily give him as much credibility as he wants. And if she was to drop out like she has done since then, it would really kind of derail him a lot to need to do another endorsement of another politician rather than skipping some steps and just waiting for someone to actually be a front runner and endorse it. Since no one came forward, I believe he did the right decision there. In regard to the super PAC, I think that super PACs are kind of an interesting playing field in that as a candidate, you can't really coordinate with them. And so even if you're condemning them, the fact is they can still operate without your ability to do anything about it. And these super PACs, when you actually look at them, I think it was like the Math PAC or Humanity Forward, they're both against super PACs. And so these were really people trying to help regular volunteers try to actually come into the area and canvass. And when you're a person who doesn't have a normal political action committee to be able to do a transfer in like Bernie Sanders did, you are at a disadvantage. It's hard for a regular, everyday American to be able to run for president. And it's really hard because you don't have years and years building out a portfolio of people who can donate to your campaign or field organizers to work for your campaign. And so he was at a political disadvantage. And so if you're willing to try and have super PACs not be in existence in the future, I think that's an okay position to hold. I personally think you also need to look at some of the blurry lines in organization types. 501c4s have this same ability to be able to do advocacy for a candidate, and a lot of the times they don't even have the necessary disclosures to have this transparency of who's giving to their organizations. And now, one of the things with a 501c4 is that they're not supposed to be having the majority of their time being spent advocating for a specific politician. However, this largely became the case with a lot of the 501c4s that was backing Bernie Sanders, which is why I'm presuming you had asked this question. You can look at the Justice Democrats group, you could look at the Sunrise Movement, there are several within it. You can even look at his own organization of a 501c4, Our Revolution, which was supporting him through the campaign. So, do I think Andrew Yang does need some more skepticism brought to him. I do think more people need to be critical of some of the actions so that he can learn where we're coming from and how we want this movement to be going forward. But I think he's been incredibly transparent with his motivations. I think he genuinely believes in the causes that he's championing. And I think that he is being very strategic in forging these alliances to actually accomplish stuff where people like, again, Bernie Sanders really faltered in this regard. You need to be able to get some access to these insider groups to be able to get your change occurring. Because fundamentally, the system is designed that you have to go through these gatekeepers. And once you're inside, maybe we can start changing this. But I think with our current situation and the current disadvantage that he was at, I really do believe that he is a great individual to continue following, and I believe he's a truly innovative individual that we should continue to listen to. So thank you for your question. So the next question that I got is from JetJetU. The question was, what is your bank account username and password? This is the IRS. So JetJetU, I will just tell you this: we'll show you me logging in onto my bank account in Citibank, but don't get your hopes up. This password's going to be changing as soon as this video is going up, so enjoy. So the username is just my first initial last name, and then the password is 5DRJHDC exclamation point. It's 5 for 5 Rose Hill Road where I grew up, and then D for my mom's name, Deb, R for my dad's name, Rich, J for my own name, H for my middle brother, Harrison, D for my youngest brother, Daniel, C for Chewy, my dog, and then exclamation point just as a special character at the end. So yes, don't get your hopes up. That's changing immediately. But thank you for your question. It's amusing to see someone trying to hack me like the IRS. Next, Mr. Woozles. The question you gave me was, what would be your tips for the Yang Gang moving forward towards 2024, and what mistakes should we not make? I think this is a great question. I think personally, one thing I would recommend is going back and watching my Yang Gang 2020 recap video. I think there are some more suggestions there that can be made, but some things that I would like to really make sure becomes clear is I think Yang needs to continue to work on making more alliances within Congress. I think we need to be trying to encourage more on that congressional level to be able to get the necessary infrastructure on this political level so that we can have the endorsements and potential backing to be able to actually secure the nomination. I think he should be, as he has already said, supporting Joe Biden to become the president so that he can get an admin spot so that he has a chance to be able to win. I also think he needs to be continuing his Humanity Forward movement. I think it's really important that we can showcase a lot of different innovative ways to advance our cause forward, really be able to provide a platform for him to be able to spread his own message going forward. And I think it would benefit him after the primary wraps up if he can be moving more towards just that podcast and away from CNN so that he can kind of retain some of his more outsider credit during that cycle when Trump supporters might be analyzing him more on CNN, because I don't think they're really tuning into a lot of the Democratic primary coverage which he's been involved with so far on CNN. And then finally, I think it's really important that we figure out the demographics that we need to target. And I think it's really clear that we need to be aiming old. And I think this is something a lot of progressives in general really struggle with, is how do you actually market a lot of these ideas to the elderly? I think one thing that needs to be said is I think he made a really good strategic branding choice of having himself be a very forward-thinking person, not really a left or right, because I think a lot of people just want us to move forward. And so I think with a lot of his focus being on technology, that becomes something that is a little hard for some people to understand necessarily. And I think especially when you're older. And I think if he had done a little bit more emphasis on his healthcare policies, on really trying to just lower general costs as well as expand the services, I think that would have gone a long way. I think he could have talked a lot more about how he was reducing drug prices. I think it would be a great way of framing comfortable retirement and the ability to retire when we're talking about UBI. I think that is really a generation that without it, we just have no chance. It's going to be more generations to come before we really have this full-on progressive framing, more populist movement be able to take place within the Democratic Party and really seize the reins. So I think Yang Gang going forward needs to continue our more friendly attitude that we had in the past, so that we can befriend these more liberal, more moderate people. And I also think we need to return to being a little less Bernie focused. I think a lot of the hatred really comes from these frequent interactions where we've kind of fed off their energy and we've become distracted from advocating our own cause and building coalitions to kind of just pointing out hypocrisy and how they're kind of harming themselves. We're going to need a lot of those young voters going forward. I don't know if you're going to have anyone like an AOC really step up and try and be someone to run in 2024. And so I really think we need to try to repair some of those relationships, but not try to overly invest in that being our coalition. Because frankly, we're not going to be able to win just solely on a young coalition. So I want us to try and keep this broad idea out there and really try and speak more to the issues again. I think that would go a long way. And so with that, thank you for your question. There's definitely so much more on that, but that could be a whole other video, and maybe I'll consider making one for the future. So the next one I got was from Shawnskioni. What did you learn the most from the primary election so far? Similar to Mr. Woozles, I would actually go and recommend you check out that Yang Gang 2020 recap video. That would help expand on this a little bit more. But I would say one of the things I learned is that you have to really choose a lane, in a sense. So you have to say, am I going to be running as an anti-establishment candidate or more of an establishment candidate? I think you saw this falter a lot with both Elizabeth Warren as well as Bernie Sanders. They both tried to play friendly as well as attacking the same people they were trying to be friendly with at the same time. You can look at Warren a lot of the time saying I'm with Bernie, but then attacking Bernie. And then similarly with Bernie saying Joe is my good friend, but then attacking Joe. And so I think you need to kind of say, am I going to embrace a full-on burn it down strategy a la Trump and really try and build a coalition that is this anti-establishment movement within the Democrats? And because you're so committed to that anti-establishment factor, you can pull in more independents as well as Republicans. Or you have to play the coalition game, and you have to be willing to actually make alliances and try to work with people to see how you can both mutually benefit. I also learned that as much as we all love and should love policy discussion, a lot of voters don't. They fundamentally don't. They want to just see someone who's competent, that they can trust to represent them, and so that they don't have to do as much thinking. I think a lot of people want that kind of representation where they are not being a part of a direct democracy, where they have to get super involved. They don't want to think about it. They want to kind of return to normalcy and not caring, because frankly, it's kind of depressing watching politics and being super passionate about policy, because so often you get disappointed. And so I really learned that there's a lot of value in just being a values candidate and saying how you are showing general competency and willingness to bring in experts and show that you're willing to just not necessarily say you have all the ideas yourself, but that you will bring people to the table. And then furthermore, I think you have to, when you are talking about policy, you have to actually listen to where voters are. I think it's great when you are more of a single issue candidate if you want to become more of an advocate, like Tulsi with ending regime change wars, like Andrew Yang with universal basic income, like Bernie Sanders with Medicare for all, free college, federal jobs guarantee, and more. But I think a lot of that kind of almost creates artificial divides, because if you don't have someone necessarily on board with that one specific policy, then they can't join you. So as much as we want those ideas and we care about those ideas, and we should try and change the conversation so people care about those policy ideas, in the present moment, taking a hardline stand that we have to do this policy this way, rather than just calling out the issue that you're trying to solve and saying how there can be multiple solutions to that problem, is automatically going to alienate some voters. So I think that's some big lessons that I learned from this primary election, is really coming to have a better understanding of how moderate voters and conservative voters really think. Because frankly, in 2016 and that cycle, all I was really learning is how fundamentally flawed our system was, and a lot of what the cares were of left politics. So I think this election really helped me learn what some of the other coalitions really cared about. So thank you so much for your question. Hopefully, again, maybe I'll cover more of these lessons in the video that I was talking about beforehand, of lessons to go forward to 2024, because you can't really know what you need to do going forward until you analyze what's happened so far. So now the next question that I got is from Varun Ilimi. He asked me, will you be voting for Yang in 2024 if he decides to run for president? As you can see here, I'm a big fan of Yang. However, I'm not going to be an idiot. I don't commit to stuff that I don't know who's running. I mean, I'm very likely going to support Yang, but I don't believe in this loyalist tactics. I believe that we should be looking for who is the best in that situation. And so I would say it's 90%, 95%, even 99% maybe that I'm going to be voting for Yang. But I had that same mindset in 2016 about Bernie Sanders, and then Yang came along. So you never know what's going to happen. But hopefully he does run again. I do still want him to run again, even if someone better comes along, because I think there is a lot of his issues that really didn't get to be championed as much that I would love for him to be able to speak more to. So thank you so much for that question. Okay, so the next question that I got is from JoshPBond. Shout out to you, Rumi. Good to see you ask me a question here. Okay, so the question was, other than Andrew Yang, if you could have one dream guest on your show, political or non-political, who would it be? That's a great question. There's a lot of people that I would love to be able to speak with. I'm going to give a couple. I'm sorry, this is a cop-out, but I would love to be able to talk with Bernie Sanders. I think it would be great to actually be able to challenge him a little bit on some of the policies that he had and really try to come to understand why he chose to advocate the specific policies that he did. I would love to be able to speak with Kyle Kulinski. I think Kyle has been one of the commentators I've always looked up to. We'll have frequent disagreements, but I think his general approach to politics is pretty good. And I would say on the issues, we agree around 95% of the time. So I'd love to pick his brain on how do you really build the movement going forward. I'd love to pick his brain on that. And then the third and final one that I would really love to be able to have on is Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart was someone I originally got my inspiration to just care about politics in general. He made it interesting, and I frankly think he was one of the best truth tellers to politics, being able to call out bullshit both on the left as well as the right. And so I'd love to be able to pick his brain again on what he's thought of what's been happening, not just from the Trump perspective, but the Democratic primary, why he chose to leave when he did right before the Trump presidency took over, and if he thought leaving might have actually made a difference during that cycle, as well as in general, like what are some like specific issues beyond, I know he really cares about animals and animal rights, so I would love to know what beyond that are his real hot button political topics that he's really passionate about. So thank you for that question, Josh. Okay, so I got this question now from gpmedtech. The question is a question on sustainability of a modern capitalist society and the disillusion that all countries can aspire to become such. Okay, so I think I understand what you mean by this, in that not everyone's going to become at the same wealth level as necessarily America is, or the same construct of a modern capitalist society as a lot of the OECD nations. And I think that's largely because we're going to be running into some general roadblocks that require some level of socialization on more than a national level, but an international level, especially with things like climate change and with things like artificial intelligence. I think both of those things are going to require a much more communal style of politics. And now, I don't believe that everything should be decided on a global level. I do believe individual countries should have some general authority over how their economy functions, as well as how they culturally want to operate. But I do believe that there are going to be some big challenges that are going to prevent just a traditional modern capitalist society. I'm not 100% sure on the specific illusions that you're referencing, but I do agree that we're not going to be able to have the same manufacturing type of society that has driven a lot of these capitalist societies. And I think a lot of it is also going to come from, there's going to be more understanding of what externalities really are and trying to bake those in. So I think a lot more countries going forward are going to move more towards social democracy, if not even democratic socialism. I think a lot of the democratic socialist movement right now has some problems in terms of just culturally how it operates. But I do think a lot of the fundamental principles of certain industries not being suited for capitalist business processes, essentially, you could look at a lot of how we do our planes currently, or utilities currently, or how we have management of natural resources or health insurance. And so I think more and more you're going to see certain industries move away from the profit motive, whether that be still privately owned but nonprofits and co-ops, or fully being nationalized by governments. Because I think a lot of these economic inequalities come from industries that we can't avoid operating with as private individuals, sucking us dry because of that profit motive. So I do agree that it's going to be kind of hard for all countries to aspire to reach what America is currently, because I think that dynamic of what we need in this world is fundamentally going to be changing going forward. So thank you for that question. Okay, the next question from AletheiaAtheos. The question is, ignoring health concerns, what would you like to eat if you could only eat one type of food for the rest of your life? That's a great question. Now here's the problem. I feel like this question is almost influenced by what you eat during the day. Because frankly, your appetite for certain foods goes down depending on the day if you've eaten it recently. So my answer now might be different than what it'll be in the future. But I'm going to say, if I could eat only one food for the rest of my life, I'm going to go with ramen. I eat that frequently anyway. It's a very privileged thing for me to be able to eat frequently, but I think it's a very flexible dish. It's got a lot of different types of ingredients within it. And I don't know. I really enjoy that. So I'll stick with ramen. And I like to go with more of like a chicken stock ramen. I really enjoy when they have the marinated eggs, the seaweed in it. I love when they have some of the katsu pork. I'm okay sometimes when they do the pulled pork in it as well. I really love a noodle that is a little bit more firm as well. So yeah, I think that's going to be what I'll go with. So thank you so much for your question. Okay, the next question is from BreadTC. His question is, would you consider trying another congressional run in the future? Simple answer, yes. That'll happen at some point. I don't know when. I think it'll probably be at some point in which I'm settled down, have a family and kids, and really feel like I have roots in the community. One of the reasons why I had pulled out from the election this past year was that I didn't feel like I had as deep roots in my community as the other challenger did in the race. And so having some level of connection, because you are now having kids going into the schooling system, you're now more settled down in a permanent location, I think would be a great time period in life to be able to do that. I also would hope that at that point I'll have a little bit more financial sustainability. Currently, I had, I'm only 25 right now, so I haven't had the time to be able to build up as much savings. And running for office is a pricey venture in terms of upfront costs. If you want to try and have a website built out, if you want to be able to get databases purchased, there's a lot of things that you have to actually economically invest in yourself before you can really even start the process of obtaining donations a lot of the time. It's a really big barrier of entry right now because of the way we have current campaign finance law. And so that was a real barrier for me as well. I do worry a little bit about some of the stuff that will be dug up by then. But I think it'll happen. I'm more than willing to run for Congress because I really do think there's a lot of policies that need to be brought forward. I really do have a deep passion for policy in general, and I do think I have an ability to be able to unite people beyond traditional ideological lenses. So I would hope to be able to run again. I don't necessarily know when that will happen, but thank you so much for your question. Okay, the next question is from Trang 2002. Where do you see yourself in 10 years in both your career and personal life? Maybe see where Toby's answer was. Hopefully having a wife at that point. Hopefully having 1 or 2 kids at that point. Probably settled down into a new community. It could still be Hoboken, but I'm not 100% certain. I would hopefully in my career have probably project managed at a different organization beyond IBM at that point. I would have helped out some nonprofits as well, be able to advance their cause. Maybe even have worked as on a campaign team as well. And there's also the prospect of, if I've been able to save well by that point, maybe I've started a business and it's been operating for a couple years. So I hope all those things can happen. They're very aspirational for myself. And I'd hope I'd be at that point where I'm potentially thinking about running again. So thank you so much for that question. Okay. The next question is from Flames of Mark. Do you think that we can have a healthy mix of both human capitalism and democratic socialism? Yeah, I do. I do fundamentally think that we can. I think one of the biggest things that needs to happen in this conversation is first understanding that the labels themselves are kind of an interference. I think in large part both have this goal of making the economy work for us and not the other way around where we are just working for the economy. And I think there's 2 big things that kind of need to be bridged in that, on the one hand, from the democratic socialist side, they have this point, which is a totally valid point, that certain industries are not well built for the profit motive. And I think that's something that a lot of people who call themselves capitalists need to accept. There's this thing basically known as price elasticity. And so when you have something that's very price inelastic, where you're going to be demanding it regardless of what the price is because it's something that you need and is essential to life, that is something that shouldn't be driven by a profit motive. That should not be something where someone is making millions and billions of dollars off of to have a functioning society. But on the other hand, there's something that the democratic socialists need to realize, which is that capitalism actually does work in a lot of respects. It's like we have been able to drastically reduce poverty in a lot of ways. We've been able to create a lot of innovation. And when you look at these countries that they try to make comparisons to, a lot of the times it's Scandinavian countries, they have a capitalist system for a lot of their market. And so there has to be this in-between point where we accept that markets are well built for these price elastic products, and that they can help fund a lot of the welfare programs that make sure that we can have this economy actually working for us to take care of our needs. So I think there is a balancing point. One of the things that I would think actually would do a lot of help to bring these 2 groups together is if we really can't move away from labels, I really do think both groups need to look at social democracy and just working together on that common label as a common ground, because that is what that system is actually in Scandinavian countries. It is a capitalist system that it actually funds a properly working welfare system. And I think we can both agree in both of these movements, we both support universal policies over means-tested policies. And so I think we need to accept that there are going to be these differences and try and have a respectful conversation to find where those boundaries really fall. But we also have to accept that we do have a lot of commonalities in purpose where it comes to universal programs and fundamentally trying to return power to the people. So with that being said, thank you so much for that question, Mark. Let's see. Our next question comes from BechtelOri. Jonathan, which of your exes would you most like to reconnect with and why? Oh boy. I'm going to go with my past girlfriend, Gabby Brickta. I think one of the problems we faced at that time was we were in very different places in our lives. We had even kind of reconnected on multiple occasions, more so kind of like in a hookup nature, but I really enjoy she loves to play games. I think she's a very confident individual. She's a very compassionate individual. I think she has a really good sense of humor. I always enjoyed how much she understood me. Like, she just understood how I really thought. And I think a lot of the frictions that we had were really temporal, where we were at different moments in our lives. I was 2 years older than her, and so a lot of times I was looking to try and move things potentially a little too quickly. And I was also in the point of my life where I was like self-sustaining myself economically, and so I was a little foolish at the time in being a little stickler financially when she was still being a little bit more supported by her parents. But I really do think now that she's working full time, now that she's kind of understood what life is like outside of college, it would be a really interesting experience to be able to see her again. And this is to go without me even mentioning, she's just straight gorgeous. So Gabby, if you ever see this, give me a holler. Love to talk to you again. Okay, thank you for that question, Bechtel. Okay, let's go to the next one. RadWavvez, does democratic socialism or any form of socialism have a future? Yeah, I do. I do think it has. I think I've answered it kind of in a couple of the other questions, but I do think one of the fundamental things that it needs to get is this cultural problem that it has, in that it sees all these other people who aren't within that coalition as just immoral. And I think that's really alienating. I think you have to make it something where it really is representing that not me, us that they tried to claim, in that it's trying to bring in how we want the economy to work for all of us, not just for their coalition. And they have to accept that some people think the economy working for them is going to be different than how they perceive it. The basic needs that they define that we should have, some may disagree that that's how it should be allocated. And that's supposed to be how democratic socialism functions. It's the collective deciding how the economy works. And so I think the biggest thing stopping them really is themselves right now, because a lot of the ideas are popular, but I think a lot of the way they sell the ideas are really poor right now, especially to the audiences that tend to be the more traditional voting coalitions. So I don't think they're super far off. There's a reason why I once joined the DSA. I even purchased lifelong membership with the DSA, so technically I am still a DSA member today. But I do think they need to rework how they sell themselves, because I don't think it's a particularly inviting culture right now. So with that being said, I think a lot of the challenges that we're going to be facing are going to require more socialist tendencies, as you're kind of seeing with this coronavirus. So I think there is a future for it. I don't know if it's necessarily a future with that label, but I do think a lot of the philosophy is going to have a place in the future. So thank you so much for that question. Okay. Next question comes from RyanKendrickYT. How do we bridge the progressive divide and win next time around? This seems to be a very popular question so far. So I would say, listen to some of the stuff I said beforehand. But I do think one of the things that we need to do more is figure out ways where we can actually collaborate better. I think one of the things that we need to have is that we're not all going to agree at any point. And that I think a lot of the times we can be more individual issue advocates compared to maybe ideology advocates. And so something that might actually really help bridge this divide is really focusing on democracy reforms. So you can take examples like ranked choice voting. If we had ranked choice voting, there's going to be way less incentive for us to try and tear each other down. And that's because we need to try and help people think of us as their potential second options because of ranked choice voting. And when you are not trying to tear each other down necessarily, it forces you to actually have to listen to one another and potentially be more willing to make concessions as well, because that's part of being just a friendly partner, a friendly coalition builder, because you have to respect that other people are going to have different ideas. And now you don't have to actually agree with all their other ideas, but you should give it the common respect to be heard and then to actually challenge it on why you think it's not a good idea, rather than just labeling them as unrealistic or immoral. And so I think focusing on democracy reform is one of the biggest ways we can potentially unite the progressive, because I think we all realize that the government is not really working well for us. It's not being very responsive to what we are actually demanding of it. And so I think if we can actually unite around fixing how government works so that it can then implement the systems that we want to see economically, that would go a long way. And furthermore, I think an idea like UBI actually has a lot of potential as well, because it helps distribute a lot of the funds back out into these communities so that they can fund their own pilot programs in their communities and that they can fund their own advocacy efforts in their communities in whatever ways they choose to do it. Because it gives you a lot of freedom to say, if you want to go start, let's say, a socialist co-op and function as your own group, that works. You can do that. You now have a ton of money to be able to fund that and start that. But if you want to, say, be a capitalist potentially, you can still start a business now with that money. So I think that flexibility of UBI would really go a long way to help people be able to have the freedom to advocate their own way while still being able to unite us in that we're all Americans, we're all receiving this, and we're all trying to lift the floor up so that no one is being left behind. So thank you so much, Ryan, for that question. Okay, the next question from SS81089. How do we measure the impact of political advertisements and the correlations between ads, events, town halls? How do we know how much impact a particular action is having? Okay, so I would say the best way to be able to see this is you have to understand some basic metrics. So I think one of the things I really enjoyed that I saw when Yang was doing his campaigning is having scorecards. You have to understand where people were beforehand and where they were afterwards. And then say, okay, maybe leave some feedback so that we can actually understand why that worked. I think that will have a large impact on events. And then you say, okay, we set up this style of an event. How much did this event cost us to set up, both in time as well as money? And then you could see how many conversions you've made from that process. Similarly, advertising has a similar impact, and you can see how many impressions did I get per ad, how many conversions did I get from people potentially going and clicking onto the website compared to the past. I think a lot of the things that we need to do with advertisements is we actually need to drive calls to action. So you're not just seeing some random, here's who I am, and then you forget it because you go on your way, but something where it says, take action now, so that you can actually start measuring it. Because I think without actually having some form of feedback mechanism, we're never going to really understand the impact of all these types of events, whether it be advertisements on TV, events like giving a rally, or just having town halls. So I think that would go a long way. And then I think one other thing is we have to look at how it drives our individual donor numbers, not our total donation numbers, but our individual donor numbers, because I think that is the most reliable metric. It's kind of hard to say maybe you did win some poor voters, but this is going to be kind of messed up. But poor voters just don't vote as often. It's harder for them. And so when you're thinking about how to actually win these elections, donors are still a good metric for that. And now this didn't work necessarily with the case of Joe Biden. He actually didn't do particularly well with that. But the reason for that is that he largely had a lot of default support where you had people who weren't necessarily the politically active, really need to engage. They were just going to turn up and show up for him anyway. And so they didn't feel like they had to really fund an organizing process. It's a pretty atypical phenomenon that Joe had this happen so easily for him. And I think a large part of that is that he got a lot of free coverage from the media, as well as he had super PACs that were supporting him to large dollar donations to be able to spread more awareness. And so I think individual donors is a good metric, but I don't think it's the complete picture. And so I think we need to kind of have a multi-metric kind of scorecard in a sense. So that could factor in like institutional things like endorsements as well. But I think in terms of the specifics that you asked, I think you need to have each of these really have calls to action and feedback mechanisms to really be able to gauge how successful they really were. So thank you so much for that question. Okay, the next question is from Subzotic. At what capacity do you think how well the U.S. is handling COVID-19, and do you believe they will pass UBI without any means testing? Okay, so I think that the U.S. is not particularly handling it well. I think a lot of it has to do with two regards. I don't think the emotional level has been actually handled that well, in that a lot of this disregard for what the scientists were saying from the top, from people like Trump, really really hurt people in terms of saying, can I trust that this is being managed well? Should I be scared or not? And so when you dismiss someone's opinion, it makes them feel like they're being gaslit and that they need to take matters into their own hands to protect themselves. You could see this with people making binge runs to go get toilet paper, even though no symptoms really require you to have extra toilet paper. You could see this with people purchasing more guns currently. A lot of this is just instinctual protectionary processes, because I think a lot of the people are less scared of necessarily the virus itself than the actual economic fallout that could potentially happen from it. And I think that is a big problem. I think furthermore, as you've seen with a lot of the recent violations of the Stock Act by some senators, this has been information that we've known about for several months, and we didn't treat this seriously. And so we weren't proactive then, and now we're trying to scramble now, and it's become an emergency because we weren't proactive. We are falling way behind a lot of these other countries in terms of being able to administer tests. I know personally, my brother was sick, and frankly, I feel like I'm getting a little sick now too. And we were trying to call the hotline in New York, and there was a 140 to 150 listed wait time, but we never actually were able to get off the line. They didn't have any callback mechanism, and so there's a lot of people out there who are not being able to get tested. There's a lot of extra anxiety that's building because they can't get tested currently. And I think this is a really big problem in terms of just the economy, because I think uncertainty in general is always a bad thing for the economy. So I think that's been the biggest mishandling. And in terms of your second point, are we going to get a stimulus package that is universal, like a universal basic income? Probably no. It's really sad, but that's just my cynicism at play with how our current Congress works. I don't think you're seeing Trump necessarily champion it. You're seeing both the leader of the House in Pelosi as well as the leader of the Senate in McConnell really not go for it. McConnell has been willing to potentially do it as like a one-time payment. He has suggested means testing at times. And so I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am going to be wrong. And I also want to note that I think a lot more needs to be done than just UBI to be able to address this crisis, because I do think you need to freeze a lot of the general payments that are being done through this process, such as rent payments, such as debt payments, because otherwise you're not really giving people the resources they need to actually survive. You're just funneling that back up to these powerful institutions who are probably doing okay in general right now. So I think we do need to do much more than that. And I would say potentially, as much as I advocate for $1,000 a month in general for a universal basic income, during this crisis, I might suggest that we go even higher to where Bernie Sanders is suggesting it at $2,000 a month, just temporarily, and then going back down to $1,000 permanently. So thank you so much for that question, Subzotic. Okay, second to last question here. Discipleofluigi. Basically, what made you decide to get vocal about politics, or more than that, give voice to others in politics? Okay, so to your first question of what made me decide to get vocal. First and foremost, I wanted to get vocal because I wanted to have a way to actually influence what was happening. I've always enjoyed having some sense of control over my own life, and I had been, politically curious. I had started following Bernie Sanders back when I joined on Twitter in March of 2016. I had been following The Daily Show a little bit beforehand, and I wanted to be able to, A, be able to, hear more people, but B, be able to share my thoughts, because, as inexperienced as I was, I'm still a democratic citizen of this nation, so I should have some level of voice, even if it's not perfectly informed. And I figure when you speak up, that is a large way in which you get the necessary information back that you need to be able to grow. And so I wanted to speak up and become more politically active because I think that there are a lot of problems that are going to be facing my generation going forward. And that a lot of the ways we're doing business as usual just don't make sense and deserve to be called out. And so Bernie kind of had awoken me in 2016 to a large fundamental way of not just like the Republicans were corrupt, but that the system as designed, both for Democrats and Republicans, has incentives for corruption. And so the only way I figure we can try and combat a lot of these big money influences is by having our own voices be heard. And that comes to my second point, which is, why did I start trying to give other people a voice in politics? And the reason is, frankly, because their voice is being drowned out and they deserve to have a voice heard. I think it's really important to be able to hear from regular people because, frankly, that's usually who votes anyway. And so you need to understand not just what the talking heads are saying in terms of this kind of very almost elitist perspective, because a lot of the times it is just millionaires being paid by billionaires in the news. You need to understand the real life experiences of people working within this system. I came from a relatively upper middle class background, and so I haven't necessarily had all the exposure in the world to a lot of how these government programs, especially the welfare systems, have operated. And so really being able to bring more people into the conversation who have had those real experiences is a really educational process, because I would also say a lot of the people who lead us currently don't have those experiences either. And that's a really big problem. And so I think it's more important nowadays that we can get more of those voices involved in the process so that we can better inform ourselves of what's going wrong so that we can understand what we need to change. So thank you so much for that question, Discipleofluigi. I hope I answered your question. Okay, this is our last question. It comes from JRLeon80. Who do you think Biden will pick as VP, and who do you like to be Biden's VP choice? Okay. So, in terms of who I think it's going to be, I really do think it's going to come down to 3 options. And I know this is kind of traditional in terms of like what everyone's saying, but I think it's because there is some truth to it. And I think that's Amy Klobuchar, I think that's Kamala Harris, and I think that's Stacey Abrams. I really do think that there's not going to be a progressive that they're going to be giving the mantle to, mainly because I do think a lot of the Democratic establishment does realize that Joe is going through some cognitive decline and that he's old. And so that they need someone who they can trust to man it if Joe can't make it through a whole term, or have someone that they feel like they can set up if Joe can only serve 1 term. So I think those are the most likely picks. I think that the people that I would like to see him pick, there are some options out there. I would say I have 3 top ones I would be kind of interested in seeing picked. One is Barbara Lee. I think she is, one of the more like insider progressives. She's had a very long track record. She hasn't been necessarily vocal against the party. She didn't even really challenge Pelosi this past election cycle, despite a lot of people petitioning her to do so. She was correct on the Iraq war, which could really help counterbalance people's concerns of maybe how Joe Biden will operate on foreign policy. So I think that could be a potentially good pick. I think Katie Porter could be similarly a good pick. I think a lot of people really saw how she could stand up to a lot of these very powerful individuals. Like you saw her really dissecting Jamie Dimon's organization and how they were underpaying their employees. And I think people really see that she comes from a true working class background. So I think she could be a potentially good pick. And then I think third, Tulsi Gabbard would be a really phenomenal pick in that she has a lot of the appeal to more of that like anti-establishment sectors of the Bernie movement as well as the Yang movement that could potentially prevent them from just writing in or not voting or voting for Trump. And she has the highest appeal among the Democratic candidates who ran this year in terms of recruiting Trump voters. And so I think that would go a long way to be able to help Biden be able to more confidently win this election against Trump. So thank you so much for that question, JR. And thank you so much to all of you for being able to ask your questions here today. I'm expecting that I'm going to be doing this a little bit more often. I'll be doing this probably once a month. So I'm thinking the next time I'm going to be making a video like this will probably be on 420. So if you want to have your question answered, please look out for that announcement. It will probably come out 1 week before then so that I can collect all of your questions so that I can answer them like I did here today. But until next time, my rosebuds, I hope you have a great week. We're going to be having a great schedule coming out. We're going to be having an episode each day going forward. Normally, they're going to be moving a little bit more towards individual commentary again. I think that's going to be really important so that I can put out more frequent content. It'll also let me kind of give more of this personality as you've been seeing today and trying to maybe bake in a little bit more humor into the segments. I also think it's going to be really interesting this upcoming week because we have a really great cast, because as soon as I declared I wanted to do more individual segments, of course I get good interviews. So on Tuesday, the next day after this video goes live, you're going to be seeing my interview with Mike Breuer. And that was a great interview. We've already did it. I'm just editing it and it'll come out at that point. The next one after that you're going to be seeing is my interview with Nerds for Humanity. Again, I've had him on the program beforehand. We had him on for the candidate supporter debate. That was a really interesting conversation, being able to talk to him about his top 3 priorities. After that, you're going to be having a conversation come out with David Kim. David Kim is also running for Congress, so that should be exciting. We haven't necessarily recorded yet, so I look forward to having that conversation with him. And then after that, we're going to be having an interview with Russ. Russ is a candidate currently running in New Jersey 6 for Congress. And so I am looking forward to being able to talk with him as well. So we have a really great show lineup this upcoming week. So please make sure that you are subscribed so that you are notified when those videos come out. We're also going to be having the week after that some more congressional interviews. So as much as I wanted to do individual commentary, I'm not going to turn down great interviews with progressive congressional candidates. So Rosebuds, we have a lot to get to. I'm really looking forward to having this movement grow. And thank you so much again for asking your questions that you did today. Until next time, I hope you stay rosy.